Hi students, and welcome to your mini lecture on anatomically modern Homo sapiens. This is How We Became Human 5, and today we are finally reaching that point you have been waiting for in hominin evolution, anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Today we're going to be looking at some of the features of anatomically modern humans, and at the end of this lecture and at the end of reading and studying the information in your textbook, you should be able to describe those features of anatomically modern humans. We're also going to be discussing two different models for where anatomically modern Homo sapiens emerged. And I will be going through the way that these are laid out and the evidence for both of these. We'll be talking about three particular sources of evidence. We're going to be looking at paleontological and geological evidence. So paleontological, old bone, and geological and stone information. Secondly, archaeological information, that's the cultural remains. And third, we'll be looking at genetics, and I'll give examples of each type of those pieces of evidence. We will also be looking at the stone tool advances in the upper Paleolithic and later Stone Ages, so make sure you review those in your textbook and pay attention here. We'll be talking about the symbolic nature of burial practices, art, and ornamental objects. And finally, we'll be talking about different techniques to try to understand how we can determine the most recent common ancestor, MRCA. So again, make sure you're both reading in your textbook, doing all the supplemental material on Blackboard, and taking notes from these lectures. So when we say anatomically modern Homo sapiens, what are we talking about? Well, this name, anatomically modern Homo sapiens, is again sort of a generic term for modern humans. Some scientists prefer to give modern humans a subspecies name, so they're Homo sapiens sapiens. But our textbook author is using the more generic term and using it to describe the set of features that make us different from archaic Homo sapiens and Neanderthals and any other earlier hominids. So these early Homo sapien or anatomically modern Homo sapien fossils are quite rare actually. You would expect to find quite a few of them, but we have not that many in that transition period that we're really interested in, wherein we should see the emergence of them. But by 150,000 years ago, the fossils in Africa began to look more like what we would expect of an anatomically modern Homo sapien. And by 40,000 years ago, we do not have fossils of any other hominins. In fact, anatomically modern Homo sapiens is the dominant hominin species. So let's think about some of these anatomical features of anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Here on this image is the same one you have in your textbook. You have an archaic Homo sapiens minus his jaw, a Neanderthal, and an anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Just by looking at these three images, you should quickly be able to identify several features that set us apart from these other species. So take a minute to think about what they are and see how many you can name and circle or describe if you were to see an image like this. Okay, you're done with that? Great. Now, let's think about this. I'm not going to give you all the information and all the details because you've already studied and learned about it in your textbook, and we've just talked about it in previous lectures. But just think about some of the ways that we're different from Neanderthals, for example. And here I've given you a hint. It's not the large brain. Think about the size of the Neanderthal brain. Look at this image. The Neanderthals had quite a large cranial capacity. But we have a more gracile or delicate skull than Neanderthals did. We have a more delicate postcranial anatomy. We have much less brow ridge than Neanderthals. We also have a very flat face with a canine fossa. Again, you'll recall that Neanderthals had that mid-facial prognathism, that sort of pulled forward look here in the mid-section of their face. And anatomically, modern humans have very small, or have not very small, but we have small teeth and jaws. And finally, we also have a chin. So looking at a modern Homo sapiens skull should be quite easy to identify in comparison to the other hominins. Now you may be asking yourself, well, how did this weird chin hominin with a flat face and a big forehead, well, how did that species become the dominant hominin? What's going on in terms of the fossils that can help us out? How can we understand this? Well, we have two models we're going to be looking at today, and I'm actually going to then introduce you to a third one that's not in the textbook. But we're going to talk about two main text models that are in the textbook. This is the first model. It's called the replacement model. And in this model, we see that we have modern humans evolving in one location, Africa, spreading out and replacing the other hominins without much genetic mixing. So again, this model, the replacement model, is sometimes called out of Africa to, because the original movement out of Africa was Homo erectus. So here we have out of Africa coming these anatomically modern Homo sapiens, spreading geographically and replacing any other hominin populations they encounter, and with very little to no admixture. In other words, rather than mating with and absorbing those populations or mingling with them and becoming a hybrid, there's very little mixture going on. The second main model we'll talk about is called the multi-regional model. And this model has this idea of these populations in these different regions during that mid to late Pleistocene having gene flow between them. Again, if you think about what gene flow is, it's simply that movement of genes from populations. It can occur through migration and through bride exchange or capture of women or men warring in one group and then leaving again. So any way that intermingling of populations occurs. And what this model says, the multi-regional model, is that there's no single point that we can point to say this is where anatomically modern Homo sapiens evolved. There's not a single population or a single area that they evolved in. But instead, what happened was that during that period, these populations of hominin in different regions continued to intermingle, giving rise to anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Here's a way to think about both of these models side by side. So in this picture we have time, again, moving upward from the past to the most recent time. We have this replacement model here, starting with Homo habilis. Both of these start with Homo habilis in Africa, eventually evolving into Homo erectus that then disperses out into Europe and Asia, but also continues in Africa. This replacement model suggests that then we see these archaic Homo sapiens in Asia, Africa, and Europe, but only in Africa do we see the emergence from those archaic Homo sapiens of anatomically modern Homo sapiens who move out, then continue to populate Africa, move out and populate Asia, and move out and populate Europe, without mixing with these other populations. The multi-regional model, on the other hand, starts out with Homo habilis that evolves into Homo erectus, and in Africa, Asia, and Europe, you have this continuation of gene flow between these regions as you see the emergence of archaic Homo sapiens that eventually have enough characteristics that make them different, and so we would call them anatomically modern Homo sapiens. And again, these little lines joining the regions would then suggest gene flow. So what we want to do next then is ask ourselves, what kind of evidence do we have that can help us determine which of these models is more accurate? So we'll have to start off by thinking about the paleontological evidence, and those are the human fossils. And unfortunately, from the very beginnings of this, in the mid to late Pleistocene, we don't have a huge abundance of fossils to determine what's going on. So we can't use just fossils to figure this out. We can't rely either on archaeological evidence alone, because none of these fossils are related. You know, there's not a single tool, for example, that is associated with moderns versus archaics or Neanderthals that sets them apart. And often the fossils that we do find have features that sort of are archaic Homo sapiens or Neanderthals are not completely anatomically modern Homo sapiens. But let's look and see what we do have. So here are some examples from Africa. Here on the right, you can see the Herto skull that dates back to about 160,000 years ago. And you can see we have still a bit of a brow ridge, but we have quite a bit of a forehead here. And so we have a very modern looking skull in that sense. And here is an image of what this gentleman may have looked like. So we have archaic Homo sapiens in Africa from about 600 to 200,000 years ago. And then we start to see fossils that look more modern. We have one called AMHS1 that dates to about 195,000 years ago that looks quite modern looking. We have this Herto skull here from about 160,000 years ago. It's from Ethiopia, but we also have some from Tanzania and South Africa. And then by 150,000 years ago, the fossils begin to look much, much more modern, and perhaps this is where we can begin to give them that subspecies name, Homo sapiens sapiens. And in fact, by 100,000 years ago, we have a complete transformation in Africa, and you do not see any hominin skulls or other material younger than 100,000 years old that is not modern. So that's what's going on in Africa. We do, again, like I said, we see fairly recent changes to modern, but we have these moderns emerging possibly 150,000 years ago, and definitely by 100,000 years ago, a complete transformation. Now, where else should we look? Well, one place to look if you're thinking about a replacement model would be the Near East. I mean, that's a good place to look if you think about hominins moving out of Africa and replacing other populations. Well, they've got to get out of Africa somehow, and through the Near East would be a great place to migrate. So this would be a place where you would expect to find certain fossils at a certain time period if you're hoping to support that particular hypothesis. Well, what do we find? Well, we do have some fossils in Israel dating back to about 110,000 years ago to 90,000 years ago. Oops, I went too far. This is Shkol 1 from Israel. Again, you still see it's slightly less modern because it has a bit of a brow ridge, but it is much more modern in the shape of the skull here than it is archaic. And we do have a nice chin as well. You can see here a prominent mastoid process and other features that help us identify it as more modern. Interestingly enough, in the Near East, in Israel, we have these sites where we see anatomically modern Homo sapiens, and in the same region or even in the same site, we might see, so pretend like this is Israel here, here's a site, fossils of modern Homo sapiens, and then a few thousand years later in that same region, fossils of Neanderthals. So we don't see these two groups necessarily cohabiting in this area at the same time, but there seems to be, as the glaciation came down across Europe, the anatomically modern Homo sapiens moved south, and so did the Neanderthals. And as the Neanderthals went back into Europe as the glaciers receded, we have anatomically modern Homo sapiens moving northward again. Well, what do we see in Europe then? You know, when did these anatomically modern Homo sapiens even reach Europe then? Interestingly enough, modern humans were not in Europe very recently. So I'm sorry, Europeans who were hoping to find Europe as this bastion of wonderful civilization and emergence of modern humans, they didn't really make it there until about 40,000 years ago. We have not even very good evidence from those very early modern humans in Europe. We have some tool evidence. We have a cave in Romania, and we have the oldest European modern humans, maybe 36 to 24,000 years old, those early fossils. Some of the best known anatomically modern Homo sapien finds in Europe are from the site in France known as Cro-Magnon. And these Cro-Magnons are, so if you hear this term, oh, he's a Cro-Magnon, what they're referring to is an anatomically modern Homo sapien in Europe. So an early modern human in Europe. But that particular site dates about to, let's see, I think around 27,000 years ago. Here's one of the famous fossils, the old man of Cro-Magnon. He's also, again, an older, at an older age when he died, and you can see there's like he's lost some bone. He has bone loss around his jaw, indicating his old age at death. And interestingly, these are very clearly anatomically modern Homo sapiens, and quite different than the Neanderthals that existed in that same region. So some paleoanthropologists have suggested that modern humans, as they moved into Europe, quickly replaced any of these Neanderthal populations there. Where else should we look for fossils? Well, let me find a world map for you. Well, let's see. I tried to find a nice globe for you, but I have a gigantic globe. It's in my attic, and my tiny globe might be too small. So I found this globe pillow for you to look at. But here we have Africa, and we've just been talking about anatomically modern Homo sapien moving out through the Near East, through Israel here into Europe. And again, you have to think about the glaciers in Europe keeping this quite cold during this period. So if anatomically modern Homo sapiens is moving through the Near East here and isn't heading towards Europe where it's too cold, we need to be looking here into Asia and Southeast Asia to see where they are moving next. So this is going to be an interesting place to think about which fossils we should find in that region. Okay. Unfortunately, this part of the story is not so exciting because we do have a gap in the fossil record between about 140,000 years ago. So the fossil record from this region is quite spotty, partially because the work has not been done in terms of paleoanthropology, partly because some of the sites are very inaccessible. So some of these sites are along the coastline. I've read about one site where people had to rappel down the side of a cliff to get to a cave where they could find some remains, and partly because of the geopolitical situation in this region. We do have some, oops, I went too far. We have some interesting finds at the upper cave at Zucaudia in China. And as I mentioned, this cave, I've actually mentioned this cave before because in lower layers of this cave you have other hominin remains, but you have anatomically modern Homo sapiens in that cave dating to about 25,000 years ago. We have some other dating from from Asia, like Borneo, for example, and Java. But again, the dating there is problematic because of the particular geology of that region. So we have some difficulty tracing the route of anatomically modern Homo sapiens as they travel through this region. It is interesting that those anatomically modern Homo sapiens in China very clearly resemble European remains of anatomically modern Homo sapiens dating to that same period. And this is evidence that should suggest that they have a common origin in Africa, because we're not seeing local regional continuity. In other words, there's not sort of a local form that continues in terms of that fossils. Moving then further east, oh, let me get my map again. Here we go. All the way over here, here's Indonesia. We next get to Australia. And this is very interesting. So the remains in Australia for anatomically modern Homo sapiens date back to even earlier than those anatomically modern Homo sapien remains in Europe. So apparently anatomically modern Homo sapiens have moved out of Africa through the Middle East, across Asia, probably along the coastline, again, where remains do not fossilize necessarily well or are lost quickly, and across these sort of shelves of land that we call Sunda and Sahul into Australia by 50 to 40,000 years ago. Now, Sahul and Sunda, Sahul is this name for Australia here, this land mass, I should call, that encompasses Australia and these surrounding areas like Papua New Guinea up here. And Sunda would be like Indonesia. And during this period, the land masses are larger because there were greater ice sheets at the poles, so that sea level would have been lower. So moving across Asia into this region would have been possible by land, but these two here would not have been connected by land. They would have been some sort of rafting necessary to move into Australia. But in Australia, we have things like the Lake Mungo site, where we have this beautiful burial of an anatomically modern Homo sapien, and I believe it even has some mineral deposits to color it. So that is some of our paleontological evidence of this early emergence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Next, we want to think about the archaeological evidence that we have for their emergence. So what kind of tools do we see using? It would be really amazing if anatomically modern Homo sapiens emerged in one place with a very specific tool, and then they carried that with them as they moved out throughout the world, and we could trace how that tool moves across the planet to discover how they migrated. Unfortunately, that's not quite what we find. We do see that anatomically modern Homo sapiens use standardized production of blades. And remember, we have that blade which is twice as long as it is wide. And we see a greater reliance on blades, and eventually we'll see microliths dating to about 25,000 years ago in Europe. So this is that upper Paleolithic period in terms of stone tools. And those microliths are small flake tools that are made to be attached to wood or bone. So these microliths are probably what you think of when you're thinking of an arrowhead, for example. So, an arrowhead is made to be attached to a piece of wood, because it has these little notches on it to be attached. So what we start to see with microliths are small stone tools with these attachment pieces on them. This one is made out of obsidian, so it's quite sharp. And here in this image too, you can see something like a barb, a fishing barb that could be used for fishing, or even a sewing needle. And these again are something that we see in Europe maybe around 25,000 years ago. And so early archaeologists said, well, it looks like we start to see this Upper Paleolithic emerging in Europe. And we even find, bone, ivory, antler, shell tools as well. But the truth is, looking at the evidence again, there's been a recognition that these tools that we thought were being emerging in Europe first probably emerged in Africa prior to that. So between 280,000 and 75,000 years ago, we start to find more complicated tools such as blades and points rather than just scrapers. And even by 65,000 years ago, some microliths in Africa. So it appears that rather than there being sort of this revolutionary change of tools, primarily in Europe, it was more a gradual change. Another interesting tool that comes about quite later is the atl, the spear thrower, and it's this piece of wood here with this carved notch in the back that you hold, and you place your spear in that notch in the back, and so when you throw your spear, it provides additional thrust for your spear. It's kind of like these tools you use to throw a ball for your dog at the park. Because it uses that same sort of principle of extending your arm to provide more thrust for your spear, or in the case of your dog, for the ball. And those were start emerging in the fossil record, maybe 25,000 years ago, and then around 17 to 15,000 years ago in Europe. But they were a quite remarkable change in terms of technology. All right, so what other archaeological evidence do we have? What are they eating? We can look for trash heaps and remains to figure out what they're eating. No agriculture, of course. Agriculture was really not developed until about 12,000 years ago. We do start to see some specialization or regionalization of food, perhaps even earlier than 40,000 years ago. Along coastal areas in Africa, it appears that populations were using local fish and shellfish as large sources of their food. We notice by looking at teeth and the microwear on the teeth that during the Upper Paleolithic, that's about 26 to 20,000 years ago, that they're eating more vegetable matter. And we can get some concept of their food and their ability to hunt by looking at what they are hunting. We also want to look at archaeological evidence and symbolism, burial, and art. One of the earliest sort of representational art forms we find is this Venus of Willendorf from Austria. It dates back to about 25,000 years ago. And so honestly, this symbolism art, that kind of representation occurs fairly late in that archaeological record of modern humans. So starting around 50 to 40,000 years ago, we see some evidence of ornaments and cave art and mortuary practices, so some sort of practices related to burial. So we had, for example, at Lake Mungo in Australia, we have this minerals applied to the body to give it coloring. We start to see shells and beads with holes in them so that we can have that symbolic group belonging or decoration. And then starting around 28,000 years ago, we have burial pits with grave goods. So we have remains of humans where they put things in with those bodies as well. We also start to see some beadwork. Now that doesn't mean that you have the actual garment that saved, but we have these beads, and if you find them in situ in the position in which they were buried, sometimes you can determine how they were attached to a garment as well. Cave art is something that, again, appears maybe around 30 to 32,000 years ago, maybe 35,000. One of the oldest known cave art is from France, from a cave in France. I'm not going to try to pronounce the French, but there was a film a few years ago called Cave of Forgotten Dreams that was made about that particular cave, and the film was actually filmed in 3D because the artist used the contours of the cave to make these drawings quite realistic and lifelike. So that's another type of evidence that we try to use to think about where we see these things emerging and what kind of patterns we can find in that evidence. Another type of evidence we have to help us understand where anatomically modern Homo sapiens arose comes from genetics. And so geneticists will use various techniques to try to recreate this idea of the most common recent ancestor. So in other words, where does, for all living humans today, where can we trace back an ancestor that we all share in common? So you can think about any two people in our class and think about where did they share an ancestor in common. So you and I probably, well, we don't have the same parents, we don't have the same grandparents, we don't have the same great-grandparents. How far back in time do we have to go to find an ancestor in common? But then try to imagine doing that for all of humanity. Try to go back in time to figure out where we shared those ancestors. That's what genetics can model using various portions of the genetic code. One part they will use is mitochondrial DNA that you get only from your mother. Mitochondrial DNA has a fairly rapid rate of evolution, and it does not recombine. So nuclear DNA, as you recall, goes through crossing over, where segments of homologous chromosomes are exchanged before you have this division into 4 daughter cells. But mitochondrial DNA does not do that, so it's passed only from the mother without that recombination, has a fairly rapid rate of evolution. And so when we look at mitochondrial DNA and compare mitochondrial DNA amongst living people today, we can try to create a phylogenetic tree, sort of a relationship in terms of genetics of our ancestry. And the results from mitochondrial DNA suggest that we shared a common ancestor in Africa about 90 to 180,000 years ago, which is fairly recent in terms of evolutionary scale. I'll skip that one. We also can use Y chromosome data. So unlike mitochondrial DNA that you get from your mom, the Y chromosome can only be inherited from the dad, and you only get a Y chromosome if you're a male. So we can trace back both the maternal most common recent ancestor and a male paternal most common recent ancestor. So the Y chromosome is passed down by males. A large portion of that Y chromosome does not undergo recombination because when an individual who's male only has one Y chromosome and one X chromosome, so a large portion cannot recombine with that X chromosome. And we can look at haplotypes on the Y chromosome, those combinations of mutations that are found together, that cluster together. And we can look at these haplotype groups. There have been at least 18 different major haplotype groups that have been identified. And when researchers put this all together, looking again at modern humans, comparing modern haplotype groups, they can work backwards and suggest that we had a male ancestor about 180,000 to 100,000 years ago in Africa. So all of us share this male ancestor in Africa and a female ancestor according to mitochondrial data. So here we have both of these suggesting that we have African roots around the same time periods. The next thing to look at in terms of genetics are nuclear genes. So these are segments of DNA found in the nucleus of all of our cells. Most nuclear genes, when people are looking at this to determine the most common recent ancestor, they will look at particular alleles. So again, a protein allele. So the sequence of DNA bases that code for a protein, that's a gene, and an allele is a version of a gene. So they'll look at these, and they look at something called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. So they'll look at places where individuals differ by one single base. And using these, tracing these back, using various mathematical methods, they some see an African most common recent ancestor, possibly one older than 200,000 years, maybe even as old as 800,000 years ago. So all of us maybe would have shared this ancestor, based on this data, even further back than the mitochondrial DNA or the Y chromosome has suggested. The results are different and problematic somewhat because of which portions of these nuclear genes they're looking at. So we even have some results suggesting that there was an Asian-specific most common recent ancestor. So the nuclear genes are somewhat problematic, but in general it tends to support a more recent African evolution as well. Oops, sorry. Finally, we're going to look at ancient DNA and ancient mitochondrial DNA. So far that genetic evidence has only come from living humans. Ancient DNA and ancient mitochondrial DNA is taken from fossil remains of anatomically modern Homo sapiens and some from Neanderthals. And what the ancient DNA and ancient mitochondrial DNA tells us is that, first of all, Neanderthals are clearly quite different than anatomically modern Homo sapiens. But modern humans and Neanderthals clearly interbred in Europe based on our latest ancient DNA evidence. So when we put all of this information together, all of the genetic data, our archaeological evidence, and our paleontological evidence, you have to think about which model is best supported by this evidence. So again, just to review, the replacement model says that modern Homo sapiens are going to be distinct from other hominins in each region. So we have modern Homo sapiens, which is special, emerging out and replacing those other hominins who are different. So here we come, our special little flower out of Africa, replacing all those other hominins. So we're going to be different from them. In that multi-regional hypothesis, on the other hand, modern Homo sapiens and the regional fossils that you find there will have some local continuity. So the hominins in each region will be slightly different. The genetic evidence in the replacement model would show very different species. In the multi-regional, you would expect to see continuity of genetic traits. In a replacement model, you're going to see transitional fossil forms only in Africa. In a multi-regional model, you'll find those transitional forms in every region. And for the replacement model, you would expect to find abrupt changes in technology and behavior, whereas in the regional model, again, you should find that behavior continuing as people pass on local knowledge. Now, the replacement model is understood by most paleoanthropologists as being more correct, even though we seem to have some aspects of data suggesting that the multi-regional could be correct. And in the next mini lecture, I will introduce you to a third model called the assimilation model, and then we'll go on to discuss what happens to anatomically modern Homo sapiens after it moves into this old world. How do we get to the new world? So I'll see you there.